Good evening, everyone. My name is Erica Wagner, and I am so thrilled to be here with the How To Academy. I want to welcome you all, and I'm really delighted to be here with my friends Heidi Thomas and Steve McGann to talk about Call the Midwife, a show that we all adore. I'm going to introduce them both, and then we are going to chat. I'm going to ask them questions, but I want to make sure that you have a chance to ask your questions. So please type them into the Q&A box and they will be passed to me. So do that just as they occur to you all the way through. I'm not going to save questions till the end. But again, welcome, welcome, and welcome, Heidi and Steve. The last time Heidi Thomas and I spoke about Call the Midwife, she told me plainly about its significance for her. I've never ever wanted to give up on Call the Midwife, she told me, because it gives me a platform and a place from which to tell really important stories. And I don't think that opportunity will come my way again. But in introducing her, it's important to note the other extraordinary work she's done and the influence that she's had. She's one of the UK's leading dramatists, and her acclaimed career in stage, film, and television drama spans 3 decades. Her award-winning theatrical work has been produced by the Almeida, the Royal Court, Liverpool Playhouse, and Chichester Festival Theatres, by the National Theatre Studio and the Royal Shakespeare Company. She has reimagined Ibsen's Lady from the Sea, and her new version of Alan J. Lerner and Frederick Lowe's musical Gigi opened on Broadway in 2015. Her classic adaptations for the large and small screen include Cranford, Return to Cranford, Madame Bovary, Ballet Shoes, I Capture the Castle, and Little Women. She also created and wrote the revived Upstairs, Downstairs, and the original BBC One drama series, Lilies. Call the Midwife is now in its 10th season and is seen in 230 territories across the globe. Heidi's work has been acknowledged and awarded by the Emmys, the British Academy of Film and Television, the Prix Europa, the National Television Awards, the Broadcasting Press Guild, and the Royal Television Society, to name just a few. She also appears as OH on the informative and entertaining Twitter feed of an actor called Steve McGann, our other guest this evening. This is what he once said to me about her. My wife does an astonishing thing. On a Sunday night, before the 9 o'clock watershed, she shows 1 in 6 people in this country, man, woman, and child, what backstreet abortions are like, what happens to a woman who gets pregnant by a married man and is the victim of institutionalized cruelty. She shows what socialized healthcare was founded for, where our ideas might have come from, and how they might change. And all of this before 9 o'clock. Steve, of course, plays Dr. Turner on Call the Midwife, and he has been with the show from the very first season and married to his fellow Liverpudlian Heidi for 3 decades. Last year, the pair were awarded honorary doctorates by Liverpool University, the first time a husband and wife had gained that honor at the same time. He is a leading UK actor, has appeared on stage in Blood Brothers and Footloose, and Stephen has also been in the Irish television acclaimed 4-parter The Hanging Gale, The Strauss Dynasty, and Emmerdale. But Call the Midwife's Patrick Turner has been keeping him occupied for the last decade, as well as his other career, which we'll discuss, as a science communicator. It's one he takes very seriously, and he's brilliant at it, if I say so myself. He holds a Master's of Science in Science Communication from Imperial College London, and has appeared as a guest speaker at the Cambridge, Cheltenham, Oxford, and Imperial Science Festivals. His companion book, To Call the Midwife, Dr. Turner's Casebook, was published in 2016, giving in-depth insights to the medical and social background to the show. He and I first met a couple of years ago when he published a remarkable memoir, Flesh and Blood, a fascinating history of his Liverpool Irish family as told through the medical ailments that each generation suffered. The Irish Times called it insightful and beautiful, which it is, while also being movingly honest about the deprivation and inequality from which his family suffered, conditions which still exist for so many in Britain and across the world. I am so delighted to be here virtually with both of them to discuss Call the Midwife, and I bet some other stuff too. And if we were all together, we would be giving them a huge round of applause, but I know that a virtual round of applause is happening right now. I want to begin by asking both of you kind of how you've been doing and how lockdown has been treating you. I know that you have both been actually pretty busy.
Yeah. Heidi, why don't you go first, because we work in different departments of the same show, so
yeah. And we're
both
sitting in different rooms of the same house currently.
Yes.
Make this look slightly less incestuous. It's been very interesting because normally we're filming our 10th series at the moment, and ever since we began, we've filmed through from April through to October. Winter has been about post-production and about setting up the next series for me in terms of research and storytelling. But we weren't able to start filming this year until August the 31st. We made a vow that we would get the Christmas special out on Christmas Day, as has happened now for 9 years, and we managed that. And it gave us a tremendous high, and I think it's fair to say getting back to work in the depths of January, which is an unusual time of year for us to shoot, has been quite challenging. It's just, the world feels very different at the moment. I'm doing all of my work at home and I don't go on set. Steve goes to work every day filming. That's great for me because he comes home with all the news. So on a social level, it's good. But only Steve can tell you how tough the filming conditions have been.
Yeah, I can give an example from this week. We had a very large, as anybody who watches the shows, I'm sure people watching here will recognize. A lot of it takes place in a place called the Iris Night Centre, which is a community centre where the nurses and midwives operate their sort of weekly surgery, if you like. They come an outpatients clinic. This is extremely cold in January. We've never filmed in January before, but added to that on a day-to-day basis, the trailers are cold, the set's cold, and we're not just whinging actors. It's everyone has this. It's fine. That's sort of okay. But also added to that, of course, you have the very serious COVID restrictions, which mean that what generally happens in a scene is we rehearse and then record a scene. So we go in to do a scene and Call the Midwife, and we will rehearse the kind of scene sometimes that we would like to do. And then the poor old COVID supervisor comes up and goes, that's very nice. And we've all got our masks on, but you can't stand there. You can't touch them. You've got to be here. You've got to do that. You're not allowed to go near here. And so you have to reconstruct the whole scene based on the restrictions that we have. Now we've got lots of camera tricks and we've got lots of things we can do. But the day-to-day, basically acting as a contact sport. And what we've all had to learn to do is find, like Heidi says, it's a problem-solving industry. We've had to solve these problems as they're happening on set, scene by scene, to say, well, if I can't touch this person, what can I do? How can I get this emotion across? So this week we were in this huge cold place, and I'll never forget it. At the very end of all these restrictions and problems, our first assistant then said, oh, and by the way, it's the middle of summer, so you're all really happy, and that's what we're up to at the moment. But hey, everybody's got problems to solve.
To add on to that, because I'm physically removed from the filming process, which is fine. I think as much as I can when I'm working on the script, how can we achieve this moment? Because, for example, if somebody is handing somebody a stack of linen, there's a chance that their hands might touch. And so I just put in the script, she's holding a linen basket and character B puts the linen in the linen basket. So I think about those things. But what I will say, I had a profoundly moving moment, there's no other way to put it, when I, as someone who hasn't been in the studio with the actors and the rest of the crew, when I saw the Christmas special, the first cut of it, I actually cried because I could barely see what we had, what the crew had put themselves through just to produce this. Camera work is always about sleight of hand, and certainly with Call the Midwife filming the births of babies, there's always been a lot of jiggery pokery going on, and we tend not to advertise it because I think that detracts from the audience. I think the best work in television is often invisible work, and so in many ways, we've just extended skills we've developed over the years, but I really did think the Christmas special was miraculous. And once in a while, you would see on Twitter the audience say, "Oh, look at the social distancing in this scene." And I'm like, well, actually, I know how that scene was filmed and there wasn't any. I think people sometimes look for it and see something that actually isn't there. I'm very, very proud of the way it's turned out. And I'm quite confident in series 10, which is the one we're filming at the moment. And I imagine it will be screened sometime late spring. That it won't be ready till late spring. Sometime after that it will be shown. And I think it will be enjoyed, because at the end of the day, good storytelling carries people through all sorts of scenario. And hopefully, the stories will speak for themselves. And that's what people will engage in an emotional way, the way they always have done.
I have to say, I mean, watching the wonderful, absolutely wonderful Christmas special, although you had told me about some of what you had to go through in order to film it, I certainly was not aware of anything looking any different than it ever had. What I did feel was what an important marker it was for me when life has been so far from normal. To have this wonderful show that I love, and as I said in my introduction, 1 in 6 people in this country also love. It's always special at Christmas, but it was especially special this
when
year.
I got to see that Christmas special, just from me, and agreeing with you, Erica, and this is a bit I really like to do. You take Dr. T out of it for a second. Sometimes this is the first time I get to see it very late, so I don't get privileged screenings.
No, I won't film anything.
No, she doesn't. She honestly doesn't. She's cruel to me. But it meant that the extraordinary sequence of, I hope I'm not giving spoilers to people who haven't yet seen it, but of a woman naming her lost children. You could be 80 meters apart. It doesn't matter, because the essential call, the midwife, of me streaming with tears, because there is a woman summoning her past and her testimony back into life. And this is, for anybody watching, of course, this is on the back of, very recently you had Caroline Criado Perez tweeting very movingly of the agonies of miscarriage, even for the urbane and the sophisticated people of smart lives and wonderful careers, the visceral nature. And then to watch this at Christmas, and a woman walking down a corridor, the simplicity at one time of that. But you allude to it, Erica, the amount that people, I think, needed that again in the middle of a year like this. We were certainly getting feedback to the show, a wild amount of feedback, to say, thank you, gosh, at least this is happening. Because without this, we wouldn't have that. But that genius of her indoors here, that genius of her to conjure that thing up, is beyond the problems we're solving on set. That's just beautiful.
But also the interesting thing, the Christmas special was written before lockdown. We were ready to go, literally. I think we had the big top up. We were that close to it. There was a tent, though, all the animals were ready for their close up, and we just had to stop. And what is interesting is how a fairly classic Called Midwife episode can seem to speak to people in a very particular way at a particular time. The previous series, series 9, actually screened from January, and people were watching it on catch up on iPlayer. And by the time we got to the final episode of that series, the pandemic had started. But we began with the diphtheria outbreak and all of the sort of the questioning and the panicking and the uncertainty that goes with that. And I certainly didn't think we would be in the grip of an epidemic shortly after it filmed. But I think a well-told period drama can shine a light on the way we live today. And if something set in the mid-60s can actually make people reflect on what's going on around them now, or feel consoled about what's going on around them now, that to me reminds me of why I do what I do, why I'm a dramatist, because it's about animating things that perhaps don't find their expression elsewhere.
And that leads me, I was a question I'll kind of bring forward, which is that, as I alluded to in my introduction, Call the Midwife, it seems to me, has always had a strong ethos of demonstrating what the National Health Service has brought to this country. And there's always been, perhaps less now because the show is in its 10th season, but certainly at the beginning, a strong sense of the time before and the time after.
Yeah.
And it feels to me that's always been part of your mission, I would call it. But really, how has that been during this time of pandemic? I wonder if you feel, I don't want to call it a burden, but I just think of when I look at these characters going out into the community and delivering healthcare. Particularly, I was born in America, but I've lived here for 30 years. I see what's going on in America now with their healthcare system or lack of it. I just wonder how you have both kind of felt about the show's role in that way during this time.
I think what's very interesting to me, Steve may have a completely different answer, of course, is that as you acknowledge, the show has now covered 10 years of history. We began in 1957, and this series 10 is set in 1966. Certainly to begin with, Called the Midwife borrowed from Jennifer Worth's memoirs in that it was about a society emerging from the war, and now it's about a society looking upwards to the moon and beyond it. You know, society is developing. What I found most striking and most poignant is the NHS has always been visionary, but it has always been imperfect. Its reach has always exceeded its grasp. And I try as much as is possible to show in 1966 that things were restrained. There were more hospital deliveries, for example, but the postnatal care was put onto the community midwives. So sometimes they were going in to deal with women that they didn't know, or trying to mop up after a bad experience that a woman has had in hospital. And that is something we see today. And for example, I've just been doing some research now, actually for series 11, which we'll film in the summer. And I was looking at Hansard, as I often do, and there was quite a Barney in Parliament because mental health care was becoming very, very pressing. There was a huge prevalence, a huge uptick in the need for psychiatric care and medicine. And the NHS only provided or paid for hospital care. And in the community, the care had to be funded by the local authority. And you think, oh my goodness, that's a huge sort of administrative and philosophical gulf. And that's something I look forward to sort of drawing more out of as I go forward and progress with my research, because it does seem to me today to be much more similar to what happens in 2021, you know, that people are falling into the gap between types of service and care. And so I think it's important that while we must cherish and celebrate the National Health Service, we shouldn't lionize it out of all proportion, because in many ways it is as effective now as it was then. You know, there have always been problems, but maybe in those days the idea was that you dealt with the problems rather than ditch the National Health Service. I think that's so that, you know, that's my. What about you, Steve? Do you?
No, I think the first way, just to pick up on that thing, and the great insight as well, which it's those things which always come back. You've seen them before, Erica, when we've discussed our show, but things have a surprising, when we come to each year of Call the Midwife, it's the amount of things which are still often, unfortunately, medically prevalent today. They are problems which haven't been solved. Just to take one example of Heidi's, if you have this problem of mental health in what would be 67, Heidi?
67, that's the one I'm researching.
Looking at what Sir Michael Marmot in this country calls, you know, classically health inequalities. Basically, if you're on the edge of the abyss, if you're in, you know, on the precarious edge of society, then health problems are more, mental health problems are more prevalent, because a whole network of health problems are always affect the poorest disproportionately. And what Heidi's discovering today, and Hansard again with another year, is they're copying in Poplar for the hard end of another set of health problems because of their poverty, because of their situation. And that is directly linked, as we will probably discover. So when we come out of COVID, the people who will have been hit the hardest, of course, economically, but also in terms of mental health, will always be those guys on the edge. You take one thing for me, if you take, personally, I've been supporting as an individual the test pilot for COVID testing in Liverpool. the local council in Liverpool asked me to get involved and to do some messaging. I was pleased to do so as a science communicator. But one of the interesting findings that are coming out from there was a lot of the north part of Liverpool where I was born, the poorer side, if you want to be blunt about it. They were refusing to go to the voluntary testing. And a lot of the doctors there and people running the pilots were curious to find out why. And a lot of the reason was they were terrified to find out they were positive because they were living so on the edge in their 0 hours work that if they found out they were positive, they would lose everything. Because for some people on the edges of society, it's not so simple as stay in your nice big house, do the right thing. And of course, we'll find all these things and the mental issues will be there. The other thing about this latest series, without giving any spoilers, which I definitely will not, I was surprised in episode 1 of this series that Dr. Turner confronts something which I then opened my newspaper without giving any secrets away. And here we are with this issue still being debated today. So there are unfinished things. We're not digging these things out to look for a fight. We're finding things in each year which are pertinent for drama that you then open your newspaper and you think, my God, like it was with the thalidomide people, you know, people fighting it, they haven't been fixed. Some things aren't finished and aren't fixed. And that's what we're finding. So it always has an impact, although it changes, the NHS changes. Turner's in battles a lot through what Heidi said before about it never being perfect. The onward spread of big medicine affects Turner in a way because you find he's fighting more with the powers that be upstairs, with getting funding, with getting supply, with certain people in the local hospital, with the more industrialized nature of the way health is being delivered. So it's never perfect. And we like to show that too, and Turner's at the sharp edge of that.
I think, you know, it's interesting because I'm just looking at the questions, and because you mentioned the extraordinary thalidomide storyline, which began, if I'm remembering correctly, because that was 1963, I think.
61, so series 5, yeah.
Series 5. And so I'd like to start by asking you, Heidi, kind of how you choose, it's a bit about your writing process too, kind of how you find and choose those storylines, and then also the research that you do to equip you to write them.
Well, certainly with thalidomide, that was almost unique in that I'm the same age as the thalidomide survivors. I had to stop and think how old I was then, but I was born in 62. So as a child growing up, I was very aware of children who were affected by thalidomide. They were very visible as they should be, and so I was aware of it. There were some very good films and documentaries, perhaps in the 70s and 80s, because that's a fight for compensation that is still not resolved. But I knew that thalidomide babies were being born for 2 or 3 years before the threads were drawn together. And there was an epoch-making letter to the Lancet in December 1961, where an Australian doctor noticed the prevalence of anomalies in newborn babies, where the mothers had taken medications, which could be cough mixture. It wasn't always the Distaval pill. And he made the link, and suddenly there was this explosion of acknowledgement. But that was in December 1961, so I knew that revelation would come at the end of series 5. Every series we do is set in a specific year, and that's purely because we do a Christmas special every year. Time has to move on between series. So I realized that we couldn't reveal thalidomide until the very end of series 5, but what we could do is make that story richer and more meaningful by commencing that series, which, you know, the first episode normally takes place March, Easter, with the birth of the thalidomide child. So I threaded it through the series. So that was an almost unique example of me wanting to do something, knowing I couldn't do it until a particular series. And of course, when I first had the notion of doing thalidomide, I think we were only on series 2 or 3. There was no guarantee we get to series 5. We did, and you know that was how that story came about. But what I always do is I do my own research relatively informally initially on the internet. I look at medical archives. Hansard is a great one. You know, if you just are prepared to spend days going, which I love doing. But you're literally going back to the horse's mouth. You're looking at history when it was new, history when it was policy or argument. So that's very interesting in a contextual way. I like to do my first storyline and then my first draft of a script just to get the story shaped up, but relying largely on my own research. And then we start to bring the experts in. Obviously the Thalidomide Society became involved, but to pull something else out of the air, perhaps we did an episode about Huntington's disease, which at that time was known about Huntington's chorea, and that was something I'd seen a documentary years ago. I find any notion of a hereditary genetic disorder very poignant, because you're looking at how it affects perhaps a mother and daughter, for example. But then you bring in the experts. So, and we always try and bring in two experts, because inevitably, I mean, that's a good way of getting balance, but inevitably one of them will have more of an idea about what you have to do in a drama. Because making a factually based drama work is often about what you leave out. You can't stuff every punctilious point of research into a drama, because it just becomes it drags it down under the water. So then we take expert advice on content, and that's it really. And one or two of those experts will be on set. We had a wonderful, very elderly dentist came on set a few times, bringing his wife, because at one point we had a dentist, and dental care was very different then. So it's a case of me getting the inspiration, me doing my own research, but then bringing in the experts to make sure we're watertight.
But it's interesting what you're saying, Heidi, about, of course, it's very important that it's a drama and not having to shoehorn too many kind of facts or informational points. I wonder, Steve, maybe if that was perhaps, I'm guessing, some of the impetus behind something like Dr. Turner's casebook, because in your other life as a science communicator, that must be very important to you.
There's a marvelous science communication point with all of this, wearing my other hat, which is that, what Heidi articulated beautifully then was you begin with the facts. A lot of people talk, and even in science communication, they talk about, yes, but is it accurate? You've got to be accurate. Is it accurate? Accuracy. And nobody quite unpicks that word. But Heidi brought up some very interesting things there, and it's worth unpicking them. What do we mean when a drama is accurate? Okay, so if you take, let's use the Down syndrome example. When we've had stories more than once, and of course we have a leading character who is someone who has Down syndrome. And he is every part, Danny is every part a part of our production. Now, if you say, well, accuracy is making sure that a story about Down syndrome is accurate. Now, if you go to a doctor, as a science community, you go to a doctor and you ask about accuracy for Down syndrome, he will tell you rightly about the chromosomes, and they may be something about Pallas tetralogy, phallus tetralogy, or about the facial appearances, and all of those, and they're all accurate, and they're all things, but are they the ultimate accuracy for drama? No. Accuracy begins there. But then, if you bring in the Down Syndrome Association, that of course we would bring in, is that what you want to know in drama is, what kind of names did they call your child? What did it mean? Could you educate your child? What did your child feel? And by the time an actor gets to set, it's how do we feel about this? Okay, we know what the facts are. So the facts begin as a kernel, and I like to call it authenticity. So facts start. You get some clinical, let's call it clinical facts or scientific facts, but they're only the tiny kernel around which wider facts, social facts, because drama is a social animal, a communicative animal. And in science communication, that's only the beginning. And so what I've got to be, saved through the doctor who watches this child survive through the night and realizes it's a survivor, that's not just about chromosomes. The chromosomes are important, and clinical facts are important. Using the right equipment is important. But by the time guys like us get onto the set, what you really want is, what does it mean? How scared would he be? How would he feel about this? And this is life. This is where drama becomes life. And one more thing to say about the science communication of our series is scientists often talk about, scientists talk to the general public, this entity, this strange, weird entity of which they are actually a part. But there's a lovely separation, and science communicators know this debate well. You say, well, what is the general public? What is this a great Untermenschen, you know, these general public? And of course, it doesn't really exist. The public is a wild and amorphous thing. And actually, you're in there, you're involved in the public. What we're doing in our show, what do medics do? Most people in Britain, and the 1 in 6 you talk about, they probably don't see a scientist all of their lives. Most people, you don't go and borrow a cup of sugar from the astronomer next door, usually, you know. But what I realized playing this character years ago is they all know one scientist in the community, a science practitioner, the doctor. And a doctor, medicine, is the one interface, the popular interface, where you meet humans. Not only is that, but significantly, what doctors and medics represent, probably to all of us, is not simply the only scientific practitioner most of us will ever actually have a relationship with, but the human face of science turned to the people. And that face, if you take the NHS without putting too fine a point on it, or Dr. Turner as a GP, it's a kind face. It's a human face that says, something's wrong, let's try and fix it. So actually this beautiful interface that historically that medicine has been, we are doing science communication, but the nature of that relationship is so much more than getting just the science right. And that's what doctors know, and that's what we try and do, if that makes any sense.
Yes, absolutely. It certainly does. It certainly does. And you know, talking just then about Dr. Turner. Dr. Turner is, of course, and this is, you know, no spoilers here, but is a man.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we have a very good question here, I think, from Michael, who asks, how important is it to the concept that we're all talking about now being described? Is it that the story is largely set within the bounds of a religious order and it's run and delivered by women? You know,
Heidi first, yeah.
Yeah, I think it is an interesting one, because at that time, most GPs were men. And interestingly, you know, just to pull it back to my own personal experience, I recently went to a male GP to get a top-up of routine medication, and I wanted to discuss my HRT, to which I am devoted. You'd have to prize it from my cold dead hands. But the male GP said, actually, I'm not really up to speed with this. He said, male GPs these days don't deal with the gynecological things. It's not their realm of expertise, because women now go to female doctors for their general GP care, certainly for most things below the collarbone. And so that's quite interesting. Dr. Turner as a GP, yes, he's male. One of the things I found very interesting, just as a dramatist, is the sort of the levels of respect and status between the GPs and the midwives. Our own midwife consultant said to us, if ever a doctor attends a birth, he will always be the one who hands the baby to the mother, probably because even forceps or anything, because he reigns supreme. What you see with Dr. Turner is he's a man who does respect his female colleagues. But in order to get the correct balance there, we also have a male gynecologist in the hospital, Mr. Kenley, who much more represents the patriarchal, slightly dismissive. He plays it very well, and bless that actor, he's never come to me and said, can I have a bit more light and shade? Because he's representing a historic truth. And certainly many women of my mum's generation, she had her children, I was born 62 and her youngest was born in 1970. They did not have a good word to say about their male obstetricians and gynecologists. I think Dr. Turner does represent something that was unique to that period, which is the GP obstetrician, who would deliver babies as well in a domestic setting or in his own little maternity home. I do think it's important that our gaze is female in Call the Midwife. Mm-hmm. That is absolutely, my gaze is clearly female. It is based on a memoir written by a retired midwife, and we go behind closed doors into spaces that women would only go into. In our earlier series, men were not allowed in the room. In the very first episode, Sister Evangelina says to a labouring woman, you, me, your mother and Nurse Lee, and everybody else can stay outside. And in actual fact, in that episode, the ghost of Steve's own father appeared, because Steve was born at home, delivered by a midwife who came on a bike in a blizzard. Legendary, really. But Steve's older brother can remember coming downstairs and finding his dad sitting on the bottom stair, completely excluded from the entire process. And I wanted that energy to suffuse the show. It is a story about women's experience in relation to birth. We are letting men in the room now, and I like that. It's broadened out our palette of characters. We do have men who are more concerned, men who want to be at the birth, or indeed don't want to be at the birth, but their wives have been to a class and think it might be a nice idea. So I do think it's important that we're including the male perspective, but for me, the female gaze will always be the most important thing and our defining feature, probably.
To add that, absolutely my agreement to that, if I could jump in, Erica. First of all, last year I was privileged to judge the Royal Society Science Book Prize. And me and a large panelist of people were delighted to award Caroline Criado Perez's book, Invisible Women, as the prize, and it's won many other prizes, I believe, as well. Now, just very briefly, this is a book, because it's pertinent. This is a book which talks about an incredible data gap in all parts of our society, largely also in medicine, that simply we haven't looked at women's medicine in the way that Heidi described the story. Well, I don't really know about HRT. Half the species don't have enough data. We don't have enough because the male skew of them for so long has meant that we are dangerously short of essential information on half the species. And if you take that as a political starting point to say, well, if it was all solved and all different now, then we wouldn't have that book out last year being a bestseller. So if you begin with that, I absolutely agree with Heidi about the male gaze. As a character, as a male character in this series, I always say to people myself, no, absolutely. Ultimately, even though we have a family as the Turners, even though I'm a principal GP in the drama, it is absolutely seen correctly through the lives and the trajectories of these women, as it should be. And the final point on that is, although Dr. Turner can counterpoint nicely with Kenley in the hospital, I do enjoy those few moments when I can flash a little bit of being a man of his time and make the women bristle a little as well. Where through his kindliness, he could actually be a little bit pompous and a little bit, not out of cruelty, because it's a bit like he used to smoke the fags. It's a reminder to people, this is not now, this is not, the values were different. They were not bad people, but the values were different. Remember, we're just reminding you that it's not the present day, you know? So that's important, but I absolutely agree about the female gaze. And there's not enough of it on television. There really isn't, but it is in our show.
And I suppose that the second part of that question, in a way, which I was also going to ask, is the role of faith in the show? A great many of the characters are nuns. And when I was thinking about this question, I was actually thinking about to me, it's not that faith isn't depicted on mainstream television. I guess I was thinking about The Vicar of Dibley, or Rev, or perhaps even Father Ted.
But love Father Ted.
Faith, in a sense, it seems to me, to all of those shows, is, even though the characters may be actual priests, faith is kind of a sideline. It's very central.
But also those, if I could just say, those three were comedies.
Yes, and those three are comedies.
All those characters were comic characters, and that might be revealing.
It is. I think it is. What's interesting for me is I am a practicing Anglican, and but it wasn't. What was interesting about the memoir to me was, and I met Jennifer Worth, who herself became Christian as a result of working with those nuns. So clearly there is an engine of faith behind the original memoir, and that was something I was more than happy to pick up and run with. I don't use the show to proselytize in any way, and I don't personally, obviously I've been writing the stories myself since series 2, and I don't preach religion or proselytize in any way, but I find it very, very interesting to work with women whose faith was so steady and so at the core of their very existence that it defined them. And I did spend time with the surviving members of the original order, but what it is for me is it's taken as read. And I think if you have a drama where 50% of the characters are doing what they do because they believe God has told them to do it, or because they believe an imaginary super being has told them how to do it. It gives them an extraordinary core strength. And that is a wonderful thing to a dramatist, because if you have characters who believe absolutely in what they are doing, you can push them this way, you can push them that way, but their feet stay very firmly on the ground of their own value system. And that's wonderful. You can really, I think you can extend that to our audience. We can tell them difficult stories. We can push our audience quite a long way with stories about things that may be strange to them, like female genital mutilation, because Nanata's house is a safe place for them to come back to. So there's an interesting mechanism there as well. I think one of the things that I find quite interesting is we have guest writers on the show, and I will give them the story, which I've researched in the basic manner I described. But it's very, very common for writers who don't have a faith themselves to think the most interesting thing about faith is that you might lose it. So they would say, oh, well, so-and-so can have a crisis of faith. And I'm no, just because when a person of faith, whether they're a professed religious or perhaps someone like Lucille, who is a secular person who goes to church, they don't say instantly, oh God, this bad thing has happened, now my faith is in ribbons. They say, oh my God, this thing has happened. How do I interpret it? What does it mean? How do I use my faith to help me to survive it? It's much more subtle than that. So I have found it a tremendous engine of drama. And I think the other thing that's also interesting is these sisters, who are based on a real order, worked amongst people who were desperately poor, desperately challenged, living in a society that was changing rapidly and not always to their advantage. And our nuns are Anglican nuns. They aren't under the See of Rome. And the fine line when you're writing these characters is that they are non-judgmental without ever being liberal. And I think you can, it's too easy to confuse non-judgmentalness. You know, the idea that whatever a woman has done, you know, she might, you know, she might have conceived a child by one man whilst married to another. They will not judge. They are there as midwives. Yes, they provide emotional support, but they're not liberal. They still find some of the things they're asked to do difficult. Hence, Sister Julienne was not keen on the pill. There's nothing in Anglicanism to dictate against the pill the way there is in Catholicism, but she made a very tart reference to the pill will encourage what she calls recreational intercourse. And she is not there for that in any way. And so again, it provides tremendous texture and complexity. And as a dramatist, that is what you are always looking for. And that is what fuels me, often in spite of my own faith journey, which has been complex and had its up and downs, as every faith journey does. But I think if you go right back to the 13th century, women who chose the religious life chose a very extreme form of independence from the usual societal bonds. And that in itself is fascinating and admirable, regardless of whether or not you believe in the things that they believe in. You think this is a woman of conviction. And that I am totally there for women of conviction. So that's how it works. And I do think it's an absolutely vital part of the series DNA, because we don't laugh at them. No. And we listen to what they have to say, and we watch what they do with interest.
Yeah. And as an actor, it's very interesting to me that, so my thing, very briefly, I don't have a faith, but I grew up in the Catholic faith, in an Irish Catholic culture, if you like. And until 16 years or so, I went to Mass, I went to Catholic Mass, I went to confession as a kid. So I have had a cultural experience of something I no longer practice. But I've been left a legacy for any critique, and there are many I might have about religion. For all of that, I'm left with a great sympathy for people and the force of faith in our world. It is a reality in our world. You have to be completely blind not to see how big a force. Now, this has a relevance for me as an actor. When we live in this very, very secular island, and we live in a way, in a wider, but still limited secular island of the West, in a world driven by faith in different ways. Absolutely driven hugely by faith. Now, in drama, I was interested and have been interested to see how people react to their treatment in drama of people who have a dog collar on or who have a habit on, compared to, say, a lawyer or a serial killer or any of those other more, shall we say, with serial killers, minority constituencies in society. Now think about the serial killer, if you will. Think about our approach to the serial killer. Do we make comedy series about them? No. Do we treat them seriously? Yes. Do we look into their lives as human beings? Do we ask ourselves, even with monsters and despots in our dramas, do we wish to get to the bottom of them and look how they were as people? Yet strangely for me, the minute you place them in cloth, then it's a license for caricature. And maybe if I was being arty-farty, I would suggest that maybe we're not far along in our sophistication in our post-religious secular society to yet rehabilitate faith as just one aspect of humanity in the bigger society. And so I think what our show can help to do is just humanize these people. Working with Evangelina, the wonderful character of Evangelina, she was vindictive, loud, obnoxious sometimes, and she had a habit on. And when I was a kid at school, I knew beautiful nuns and shocking nuns. And I knew nice priests and shocking priests. And what I know is that there's people inside. And what we did on this program is, no, they're medics, they're doing this thing, but for actors, how about if they're just people? Now they have faith, which is an important dynamic of their character, but they are still characters. And so it's not that two-dimensional TV vicar that you can too often get, you know? And that's why these stories that Heidi mentioned of, you know, well, they're going to go to that sort of A story if they're going to have a challenge, because we're all lazy, and I include myself, we've all become lazy at our treatment of faith post the fall of faith as a major force in our secular society. And I think we need to rehabilitate it as a force within this wider secular thing.
Yeah, and just to wrap up on that, Steve once told me he had a nun who was a teacher at school who built her own canoe. I'm dying to work that into the to Veronica.
That's really important. And that other wonderful chestnut was, ladies and gentlemen, I was taught sex education by a nun. That's it. And you know how long it took? 1 minute. And it concerned biological rats. So there you go. Nuns, you know.
Speaking of a possible storyline involving a canoe,
Yeah.
We've had a couple of questions about whether your absolutely wonderful cast, your amazing group of actors, one of whom, of course, is here with us this evening, influence the way that you write.
Oh, I mean, yes, absolutely. Well, obviously, I create characters, and then, you know, we audition actors to play those characters, and there will always be one who sort of jumps out and go, yes, she has it, or, you know, he has it. And that happens even with characters of the week. One of the great privileges for me of Call the Midwife has been this idea that I'm writing for a rep company, essentially. And you do get to know which actors do certain things well. I mean, Helen George, for example, can do a long speech absolutely beautifully. She knows where to pause, she can make herself very vulnerable. And so that was really one of the ways in which her sort of beautiful AA speeches come about. I love writing those. I know she will always do them absolutely beautifully. Mm-hmm. I also know she's very funny, for example. Yeah. And Daniel Laurie, who has Down syndrome, who plays Reggie, is the most wonderfully reactive actor. He never stops acting when he's on screen. And so what I always do when I'm writing for him, for example, is make sure I know what Reggie's doing or thinking, because other people may have the lines. His expertise and great talent isn't necessarily with the lines, it's his facial expressions, his humor, the way he'll dart a look. And so I will always try and be aware of what Reggie is doing in any given scene, so that I can give Daniel material that he will make shine. It's not about me making him shine, it's the other way around. And as ever, it's about using the gifts that people bring you. And I do feel very blessed like that. The other thing that grows over time is the dynamic between characters. For example, Steve mentioned Sister Evangelina, now no longer with us, and she hated Dr. Turner. She didn't like him to begin with, and then he kind of stole one of her members of staff, a nun, and took her out of the equation. And it was just brilliant because she could kill him with a syllable, and that was great. But Nurse Crane has a bit of a soft spot for Dr. Turner. So when she took over from Sister Evangelina, that gave me a fresh dynamic to play with. And yes, you find out things like they can sing, or in Steve's case, he can make an origami frog. That's put in.
That's a major skill.
And may do so again. Jack Ashton, who played the Reverend Tom Hereward, was not a religious person at all, and as far as I know was never a churchgoer, but he could do the Anglican liturgy absolutely beautifully. So if he was baptizing a baby or at a deathbed, I could just put stuff from the Book of Common Prayer into the script, and with his natural ability, I think, to depict goodness. I'm always very keen on actors who can depict goodness, because it's not thought of as a complex thing. It actually is. But Jack would always approach those scenes with a simplicity that allowed the complexity to shine. So I love doing that. So yes, in a word, and it's one of the things I think that keeps me going. I love our actors. I love the way they work together, and I love what they bring to the table.
Are there any, because I'm mindful of the time, we have about 5 or 8 more minutes. We could go on doing this all night as far as I'm concerned. But I will ask you both whether there are any issues that you are looking, without, again, no spoilers, any issues you're looking forward to tackling in future storylines, either for you, Heidi, or what you're, again, Steve, I know that you get absolutely no special privileges, but there may be something that you're interested in.
Yeah.
Steve, I'll start with you.
You want to start with me?
I do.
I think most generally,
You could drop a hint.
I'm not home.
Here.
Sorry, Darren.
I was going to say you can drop a hint here. You speak first.
Yeah, that's very nice. So me. I think one of the most general things I can say without getting into dangerous spoiler territory is, as we move through the 60s and you get to, say, next year, what I look forward to is when you enact laws like the abortion bill will come to fruition. So it reached a head in the mid-60s in the sense of the problems, the fallout of that issue, that very complex issue, was a problem. But by 67 and 60, now they're bringing in the act.
Yeah.
Now you're dealing with the aftermath, with what you actually do when you implement laws, and the interesting things which then happen after that happens. So, in law and in policy, it's never a happy ever after. There's always then, the potential for teething trouble, shall we say, the reaction, the kickback to the rules, the way they play. And so it never finishes. And so those things we might have seen elements of through the 60s, this most amazing decade of change. If you take just 3 things off the top of my head in the 60s, when I think back to them, it was a year when it was a time when I was just a young child. But if you take the legalization of homosexuality, the legalization of abortion, and the banning of the death penalty in Britain, you just take 3 out of the air. What an astonishing period of time of social change, because those things can still be debated by many, they can still be, but there they are. And it was that small period of time that was going through not simply wanting change to happen, but then having to deal with change when it started to happen, which is what's going to happen, say, very soon on Call the Midwife.
Yeah, I think the sort of state of the East End is endlessly fascinating. From series 3, really, 1960, you've got the influx of the Asian communities, of varying religious types and from different geographical backgrounds, as well as the sort of the growth of the Black community and the forward moving trajectory of that. So I'm really looking forward to the way Britain becomes more multicultural and how that impacts on relations within the community. And at the same time, the East End is, excuse me, being physically torn down. And one of the things that fascinates me is how society started to be reshaped by the buildings it was put into, where we've got our little tower block set and things there. So in a way, what I'm looking forward to is continuing the journey that we've started by showing these sort of physical and cultural social changes medically. I'm quite looking forward to the ventouse machine coming in, because, you know, where they deliver babies by suction. I only found out quite recently that that was sort of starting to come into being, certainly within the time frame we're looking at. And that's quite interesting, being simply on a purely medical scientific level, because we've often seen Dr. Turner with his forceps, but forceps were, you know, first used in the 16th century, and they haven't substantially altered in design since the early 19th century. So for someone like Dr. Turner to be given a new tool is quite exciting, a bit like when he got the gas in at the beginning of series 2. If you think in our first series, women were not receiving pain relief in childbirth. I think we're way off epidurals yet. I'm not even thinking about that. That will be series and series away. But I am interested at the way in which medical science was starting to liberate people, because also I have to look for new stories. We can't do stories really about polio anymore. By 1966, 67, it had been eradicated. Measles vaccine, you know, they're still rolling out the measles vaccine. So I am looking forward to the way in which medicine changes.
Yeah.
And yeah, so that as well, but we just aren't running out of material. And I think, gosh, if I'm not bored, there's hope for the show itself. You know, if I was bored or digging around, I'll think, oh God, we've done this story and we've done that story. But the fact is we haven't. So
Can I jump in, because it's 2021 and you mentioned vaccination. We are actually having a problem on Call the Midwife, because we're running out of these old diseases we started with, because we're being vaccinated. This is what was happening then, because if you have your vaccinations, these terrible things go, you know, we can get on top of them. And now we're so luxuriated in years of not seeing these detestable diseases, that now there are these cults about, you know, there's all sort of microchips in our vaccines because we can indulge this. Well, back then, my mother dragged me along.
Or indeed, we're seeing the return of measles.
Yes, a horrible thing. Just reading a book at the moment on Roald Dahl and his poor thing with his daughter in encephalitis.
yeah, I mean, it's always worth, you know, Call the Midwife can remind us of what things used to be like. Certainly, I had a brother who had Down syndrome, and at his special school, there was a little girl who'd been very profoundly brain damaged by measles. And I have never forgotten that. It certainly made me very keen to get my own son vaccinated at a time when the MMR was coming under a degree of scrutiny. But, you know, there will always be something new. For example, polio and TB are sort of on the run, but certainly mental illness is on the rise. Drug addiction is on the rise in 1967. Most of the drug addicts were under the age of 21, which is interesting. So you've got youth culture starting to turn in on itself. And then just this morning, I was reading the Medical Officer for Health's report for Tower Hamlets, Poplar and Stepney being absorbed into Tower Hamlets in 1967. And there was an outbreak of dysentery in a nursery school. Now, if that's not drama, I don't know. I don't know what is. And you know, as I say, there is always something to make me go either wow or just be a bit sick in my mouth. And then I think, no, how are we going to do this? So, you know, but humanity will always be fragile and courageous, and therein lies the, you know, the DNA of Call the Midwife, really.
Well, because our time is running to a close, what I will say to our wonderful audience, virtual audience, that when you see a storyline about dysentery in a nursery school, you heard it here first. But this has been so wonderful. It's always wonderful to talk to you both. I'm so glad that we could do this. Thank you so much for participating with your hugely busy schedules, but we the viewers are so lucky that you are so busy on the 10th season, and we can't wait. So thank you both so much. And
thank you so much. And I'll be joining the How To Academy in the audience next time, because it's a great setup, you know. So thank you. It's really lovely. Thanks for having us.